Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me again. It's my second MLconf. I did give a talk at MLconf in New York last March, and it was also on the topic of mind reading. So deep learnings are absolutely cool. Cannot argue with that, but personally, I'm still more interested in natural neural networks. And to answer the last question that machine couldn't answer, what's the purpose of emotions? Well, one answer could be to serve as a great example of where machine learning methods can actually read the mind and predict those emotions. But anyway, so what I would like to talk today about is how to try to model and understand brain from various types of data, starting with classical functional MRI data and possibly going to easier and cheaper kind of sources of data collection. Well, this work has been done by a large group of people with many collaborators within IBM, outside of IBM. I'm part of computational biology department, and we have several groups working on like classical comp bio and on neuroscience in particular. So I'm part of that group. The data collected, of course, we don't have functional MRI on premises. So luckily we have lots of collaborators at universities who provide us with their data and who have lots of free subjects as grad students. So I'll show you some experiments on those people. Well, many of you probably know, but just to kind of give a brief introduction what functional MRI is, usual MRI scanner can be used to collect not just images, but actually videos of human brain. During, I don't know, 5-10 minutes while a person is lying in a scanner, you can ask a person to do certain task or just relax, and you collect their video, basically a bunch of frames, usually on the order of several hundreds. And at the same time, you collect 3D images, snapshots of the brain at each, say, second or two. So essentially, you have a huge data with hundreds, thousands voxels, or, well, variables in the future, and several hundred samples. So it's classical statistical large p small n problem, where p is the number of dimensions and n is the number of samples. And that was always a challenge, how to learn anything that can generalize well from such data. A small number of samples, but large number of dimensions. In a sense, it's also big data, but in different dimension. Not in samples, but rather in kind of number of variables. Well, classical example, you put grad students in scanner and you ask them to play video games. They don't mind. So lots of things are happening during the video game. They're supposed to take snap pictures of people. They're supposed to pick up fruit. They're supposed to do certain other tasks that may be quite stressful. They experience a bunch of emotions. And they rate those emotions and their other mental states after their session by looking at the recording of video game. So now your task is, given the movie of the brain, can you predict, can you tell when the person is feeling sad, anxious, when the person is looking at the face, and many, many other things? Can you pretty much do the mind reading from this movie? One simple example, they may be listening to instruction. Instruction is telling them when to do what, when to pick up fruits. And it's a relatively simple signal. Can you predict that when they're listening to instructions from their fMRI? What's also interesting for neuroscientists, unlike us machine learning people, well, you can predict well, but what does it mean? What did I learn about the brain? So, for example, what kind of brain areas were involved in this task? So that's a question we should keep in mind, because that's interpretation, that's the final result of this study. Another example is a bit less pleasant. Well, other graduate students were not so lucky to play video game. They actually had a metal patch on their back, and the metal patch was heated. And here is a thermal stimulus. At some points, it gets kind of uncomfortable, and they're supposed to rate their pain. So on the right, you see 14 time series of pain ratings for 14 different graduate students from Northwestern University, rating their pain in response to the same stimulus. another interesting thing to note is intersubject variability. As you can see, the temperature changes exactly the same way for everybody. And some people seem to complain a lot, and they kind of rate their pain really in high correlation with the stimulus. And for some people at the bottom, all they're tough guys. There's no pain. Well, depending how you interpret this picture, it can be also argument. Whenever somebody says that you're complaining too much, you say, well, maybe I just have a lower pain threshold, and neuroscience can prove it to you, so don't call me like a whining person. But again, what do you do with this? You would like to see if you can possibly predict their pain perception from their functional movies from fMRI. At the same time, you of course would like to see what makes the model predictive, which areas are involved, which other features of the brain are involved. So basically what we're looking for is, given some stimulus or mental state, or maybe disorder. We did lots of work with classifying schizophrenia, autism, and ADHD, as well as cocaine addiction. I'll talk about that a bit later. The approach is, well, how to find out what's relevant. Standard neuroscience approaches are quite limited, I would say. They're simple, that's why you don't really need to learn machine learning. They use univariate correlation between voxel activity and the task, and they plot nice brain maps saying, well, that's what's involved. But obviously you miss very complicated relationships between those voxels in the brain, because brain is a network. So you can do that, and that's why in the past decade there's been lots of kind of activity in neuroscience research in terms of multivariate predictive modeling. So machine learning is very welcome in neuroscience these days. So you would like to learn a multivariate pattern that predicts well and it's interpretable. So, and that's a core focus of our research. You have your brain data, you build a predictive model, but what you're really after are the features, predictive features, or biomarkers, say statistical biomarkers. And with deep learning and approaches along those lines, of course, you could extract features from the data that can be very predictive, but unfortunately, it's not always easy to interpret those features. Here, interpretability is a must because you're trying to learn something about the brain. So the most classical thing that comes to mind first is, how about we do feature selection? And there are many ways to do that, with sparse modeling being one of the most recent popular kind of fields to combine learning a model with feature selection. And of course, various flavors of sparsity, that's what we're going to use here. The next step is beyond the brain areas. There might be things that you cannot see in the areas, but they're in overall working of the brain, like functional networks. And features of those functional networks, of those graphs, can be very telling about certain diseases such as schizophrenia, while brain areas might be not really discriminative. And of course, their final objective would be to extract features automatically, whether using dictionary learning, deep networks, or any of those automated methods, but also with interpretability as a key property. So just to revisit classical linear regression model and its application in brain mapping. Your data, your video, would correspond to the matrix X, which has rows as time points or TRs, samples, and your voxels in the brain are three-dimensional pixels that change actually their activity over time, the bold signal, are the columns in the matrix X. So it's very fat matrix, small number of rows, large number of columns, and you're trying to learn the linear regression coefficients that would be accurately predicting Y, which is your stimulus, for example, temperature that causes pain, or your perception or emotions such as kind of pain level or happiness or sadness and so on, or possibly it could be some other task or stimulus. But the focus again is not just that model. The focus is that, first of all, you would like to regularize it so it will not overfit on such large p small n data. And second, you are after most important variables that would correspond to voxels that are most relevant to this task or stimulus. So Many of you probably are very familiar with this basic classical sparse regression model called LASSO, which simply adds L1 regularizer on top of linear regression, has a well-known effect of killing many coefficients and setting them to 0, doing variable selection, but it has some negative side effects. It tends to select one important variable out of a cluster of correlated important variables. We don't want that, we want the whole area. It basically doesn't kind of take into account the structure of the data. So an improvement over that called ElasticNet turned out to be much more useful in biological applications and in neuroscience especially. You add L2 regularizer in combination with L1. As a result, you still get sparse solutions, but now you actually have a grouping effect. So, for example, you don't select one voxel, you select the whole area in the brain around that voxel because they're all correlated to each other. And here is a lesson 1. I will go briefly over several lessons we learned from trying to use machine learning in mind reading from fMRI. Lesson 1, you can never underestimate the importance of prior in your data, and well, that's kind of old classical lesson in machine learning. And in this case, using grouping, whether with LASSO or whether with ElasticNet or group LASSO or fused LASSO and other versions of sparsity that try to impose different versions of grouping was very useful. First of all, classification-wise, prediction-wise, it also improved the accuracy. For example, pain, we were able to predict with up to 0.8 correlation between the actual pain perception and what the ElasticNet would tell you, which is pretty impressive, at least for majority of people. Some people were harder to predict than others. Better interpretability, you essentially get groups or areas in the brain rather than salt and pepper picture of separate voxels. And also grouping enforces stability, which is important, very important property of models that you build in such applications. You would like your sparse model to generalize not only in terms of predictive accuracy, but in terms of model selection. The areas of the brain that are important for pain prediction, we would like to see the same areas across people. And stability was definitely improved with adding this group sparsity prior. Another example of using sparse models is you go beyond learning prediction of emotion or mental state from data. You would like to learn something about overall working of the brain. You would like to learn brain network, for example, sparse Markov network. If you use standard approaches like graphical LASSO, just L1 regularizer on top of Gaussian Markov models, you get sparsity in terms of edges or connections, but you still will include all the voxels, all the brain areas, and it will be total mess. Instead, group sparsity, again, in terms of which collections of edges are important, will select the most important areas as well as most important connections and give you much cleaner picture. For example, this was a study of cocaine addicts versus controls with our collaborators from Mount Sinai in New York City. Well, they had no shortage of subjects in this study, and they keep collecting more data. So cocaine addiction seems to be a big data problem these days, at least in New York. What you see on the top is sparse Markov networks learned with group sparsity versus sparse Markov network learned with usual graphical LASSO. Bottom line is you see much cleaner, much more interpretable network that differs considerably between controls and between cocaine addicts because you incorporated different forms of sparsity that select not just for edges but also for nodes. Anyway, the examples go on, and I probably should speed up a little bit. Another example and lesson we learned here, it's very important to combine, again, your prior knowledge maybe in form of analytical models. For example, if you can describe intersubject variability in terms of dynamical model, basically connecting how temperature affects pain perception, and you combine it with the data, you get even more predictive models. And another yet another example of lesson you learn when you try to apply sparse models in brain is that if you actually go way beyond finding the best predictive sparse model, throw it away and keep exploring what else left in the brain that still would predict your pain well or some other task, you can actually find very interesting differences. Certain simple tasks like auditory listening to instructions, after you throw away a few brain areas, few sparse models, the rest of the brain seems to be totally irrelevant to this task. With pain, it's more of a holographic picture. You throw away sparse solution after sparse solution. The rest of the brain is still predictive. You pretty much exhaust almost like the whole set of voxels, and you still have quite decent prediction, which tells you something that you will never see with standard neuroscientific univariate approaches. Finally, I'm getting close to the end of a fMRI story because I would like to talk about the Beyond scanner part. One of the classical lessons, again, I know automated feature extraction is really cool, but still in many scientific applications, thinking well about type of features that are relevant to your problem and coming up with a proper type of features may actually make your day. In this study on schizophrenia, all the standard approaches looked for differences between how schizophrenic patients react differently to the task as compared to controls. Nothing was really found. But if you look at the network properties, functional networks of their brains, which essentially correlations across all the voxels, this type of features seem to be much more predictive. You get up to 93% accuracy versus practically chance level if you just look at the brain areas. And the intuition is that we do know that 200 years of schizophrenia research suggest that it's not a localized disease. It's a whole brain network kind of dysfunctioning. That's why you look for network features. And yes, you do find much more information in those. Again, to summarize the first part, which turned out to be much longer than I expected, you can do very cool things with machine learning, and especially with sparse models that focus on interpretability, and you can accurately predict schizophrenia or people playing video games and doing certain things, even predict the kind of subjective pain perception levels. But this is functional MRI, and in everyday life, you cannot drag around your fMRI scanner, right? So you need something much simpler and cheaper that hopefully still collects data relevant to your mental state. And the applications are numerous, with like most classical one that would be, can you track mental state of people who are doing certain jobs that are particularly important, like truck drivers or train operators? Can you detect in real time that they're getting drowsy or they're kind of losing their attention? So can you prevent like tragic accidents that happen mainly because of kind of those lapses in attention or like sleep deprivation and things like that? There are many, many wearable sensors available on the market now. There are like hundreds of different types, with, of course, bands, Fitbit-like bands being most popular, and more kind of sophisticated versions coming up, like the Jawbone UP3 we are looking at right now, can also collect the data about your skin conductance related to stress, not just your accelerometer data, the hexaskin, and so on. What we tried are simple EEG devices, like the Muse EEG device I'm holding in my hand right now, and NeuroSky. From the perspective of neuroscientists, they're a joke. It's a toy. Like, oh, come on, guys. You have like 4 channels. What can you possibly measure from that? So our question was, okay, so let's actually see what can you measure, how much noise is there, and what can you possibly infer from such devices? Because if you can infer something, then you actually can do some mental state tracking in real life. So this is a device I'm talking about. It has 2 frontal channels, 2 channels behind your ears, and it measures the usual 5 classical EEG bands that have association with different mental states, from low frequency, from delta and theta, to high frequency, such as beta and gamma. One application with this type of devices that we worked on, especially my colleague Steve Heisig, is tracking mental state of a driver, like relaxation level and attention level. This is a map on taconic, like he's driving to work, measuring himself, and plotting a sequence of those blue circles that are proportional to his relaxation level. Actually inversely proportional, they're kind of stress levels. So whenever he merges on taconic, he is not very relaxed, the circle is small, and so on. So actually it seems to make some sense. It reflects the stress relaxation level of a driver, and you can actually draw those maps and see which roads may be particularly stressful for most of the people. Another example is what we did last summer. So it was a good excuse to say that we need to meditate, and this is, of course, for science sake. It's not like we're just wasting our time. So it's myself, Steve, and several other people, and several grad students who were just getting together a few times a week and wearing this device for 7 minutes, eyes closed, trying to meditate, collecting all the raw data, pre-processing them in different ways. And here is just some preliminary example of intersubject variability that we found. To make the long story short, green means below average, red means above average. On top, you have high frequencies such as beta associated with thinking more, being more anxious, not really relaxed. On bottom, you have alphas that are vice versa associated with relaxation. And somehow, it was interesting that the clustergram really clustered together all the male participants versus female participants, with male participants being mostly relaxed and truly meditating, and female participants being just vice versa. So my first reaction was, do I really need the EG to tell me that story? But it was kind of really funny that it came out this way. Well, of course, it's a very small subject study. But yes, it seems like even those simple devices, they do pick up certain reasonable signals after you do loads of pre-processing and getting rid of noise, which I'm not going to talk about right now, but it's quite a bit of work. Yet another example, again, for science sake, let's now watch YouTube videos at work. So we asked kind of 20 participants to watch YouTube videos of two different kinds. One kind being more entertainment, emotional, funny cat videos. Well, talking about those cat videos, everybody uses them for research these days. Another type of videos is Khan Academy. It's more educational, supposedly rational thinking versus emotional. And I was extremely surprised to see that we're basically extracting features from this raw data, all kind of them, first, second order statistics, looking at functional network even in this device, actually resulted in not so bad classification of the mental state between, well, quote-unquote emotional and quote-unquote logical, even in this small study. So it was roughly like 74-75% of detecting the different mental state within the person or across people, which is, to me, quite surprising. My prior about this device was, well, it's nothing but noise. Apparently not. So apparently, you can do some interesting things, and we're still exploring this and other devices. Emotive is another example. It has more electrodes and harder to wear. This is a bit more practical. But besides measuring basically signals from human body with wearables, there is a very rich source of data that should be tapped, and that's my last slide, well, second to last, where I briefly summarize a very recent work that's coming out of our group, and it's led by my colleague Guillermo Cecchi, on doing computational psychiatry with speech and text. And there are several papers that recently came out which show promise of this approach. For example, you can look at the speech graph, basically a sequence of words in an interview with patients and controls, and you can look at the graph properties, and you can easily, even just by eyeballing, say who is who. The schizophrenic speech on the left, disconnected, small clusters, control telling a story in the middle, kind of coming back to the same topic once, and the manic, who has about an order of magnitude or so more words, speaks very quickly. Maybe I should slow down, actually. and has, as you can see, many, many cycles coming to the same words, to the same concepts. Well, you don't really need to be a trained psychiatrist to eyeball the differences and tell who is who, or you can simply train a machine learning algorithm that with a 93% accuracy going to tell you the same thing. Even more fascinating recent result is a paper that just came out in Nature Schizophrenia by Guillermo and his colleagues from Columbia University and several other places. They look at the interviews with troubled teenagers. Some of those teenagers in a few years develop schizophrenia. Well, many of them don't, like about 5 out of 30. Just by extracting different syntactic and semantic features from the speech, you can pretty much say who's going to develop schizophrenia. And one of the key features is coherence, which is kind of measured by sentence-to-sentence coherence in the speech, which I will talk in the next slide. There are many other examples of what else you can discriminate using text properties. For example, you can tell who is on what drug. For example, like empathy concept and closeness of your text to empathy seem to be very predictive in certain drug abuse, for example, like ecstasy drug. Yeah, so apparently you're becoming much more empathic. And quite accurately, you can predict who is on drug or not from their speech. Coherence is a very interesting feature, which of course goes beyond schizophrenia to other mental states, and that was just a kind of example. Well, Jenna was quite viral on YouTube, I think last year, and she recorded tons and tons of monologues. Some of them were on purpose given when she was drunk, because she was trying to give a tutorial on how to put makeup on when you're drunk. So you have labeled data, that's kind of nice. Well, you look at her coherence, drunk coherence and her sober coherence, and it's absolute no-brainer. So basically sentence to sentence and skip sentence coherence separates her different monologues very clearly. And by the way, coherence is measured very simply. You just take something, any kind of word embedding. You can use LSA, you can use word2vec or whatever. You average your word embeddings over sentence and just measure angle between the two sentences. As simple as that. You can probably get much more sophisticated, but even that was enough to nail down schizophrenic subjects and, well, also tell you something interesting about Jenna's mental state. There are many more examples I didn't include here, which actually one of them I did present in New York, which involve political speeches. Like, you don't need to use any actually labeled data here. You look at certain speeches and you measure coherence, and it kind of really tells you, like sometimes people were saying, oh, this speech looked like the guy gave it when being drunk, or something was wrong. So without putting any labels on, what we found, the coherence was simply 2 orders of magnitude lower. So it's quite telling feature. Anyway, so to conclude, our focus is not only on trying to make machines smarter, but actually on trying to make people's brain functioning better. So it's augmented human goal rather than, augmented natural intelligence rather than just artificial intelligence. Well, they should work together, of course, and hopefully artificial intelligence will help to improve natural, but that's in a sense is kind of the primary objective of all that work. And the idea is that hopefully different behavioral data, text data, speech data, as well as wearable data in real time can help you detect and predict mental states and their changes, and hopefully provide a feedback that can help person, again, in real time, improve those states. Whether it's a driver getting tired, being sleep deprived, or a person kind of falling into downward spiral of depression, and the system detects that and intervenes by maybe just sending text to a friend and saying, hey, call the guy, he seems to be not his usual self, his coherence is going down in his recent emails. Anyway, so here I would like to conclude, and I'll thank you for your attention. I don't know if you have any time for questions left. too much animation. This cocaine study? So classification, it's a good question. Yeah, so basically the bottom line model, the classical graphical LASSO sparse Markov network model, I mean, it actually did fit data quite well. It's not like it was completely overfitting. So it was a reasonable dense model. Besides prediction accuracy, it's just another dimension. I mean, the complexity of the models, they may be actually equally predictive or similarly predictive. It happened that we were a bit more predictive, but it's kind of not the only dimension here. What I'm trying to say that you may have similarly predictive model, but one of them is more interpretable and kind of has less edges, or basically not just less edges. It may have overall total number of edges, but those edges are clustered around the same node. So model complexity may be even like similar, but how the structure of the model is organized is different. So the top model also selects areas. The bottom model kind of spreads all the edges, even maybe similar amount of them, across all the areas. We would like to see that model on the top, because then we can compare and analyze it. Yeah. But in terms of prediction accuracy, they could be quite similar. Although it's always nice when your model is slightly better than the other one.